Hello.
What up?
Looking good. Like that plaid. It's plaid year.
Oh yeah, love it. I buy like anytime I see these shirts, I buy like three of them in like whatever color they have.
Right.
It's silly, but it works. Let me exit full screen here, just one sec. Cool. See me and hear me okay?
Yeah, I can see you. You can go ahead and share
Let me
your
share my
screen.
screen. Yeah, we don't need to see me the whole time. Oh, cannot share screen while other participant is sharing.
Oh, let's take care of that. Here we go.
All right. Desktop one. Slides.
Beautiful.
We seeing me?
Yes, we're good.
All right.
Okay,
Should we get started a few minutes
let's
early?
jump in. Have at it, and we'll talk to you at the end.
Okay, cool. Awesome. All right, well, welcome to Laracon. Excited / nervous to be kicking things off here, but we're going to jump in with some Laravel testing strategies. So as Ian mentioned, I'm JMac, Jason McCreary, but I think the Laravel community knows me as JMac. Totally cool going by that name, had it for a while. Nice little mashup of Jason McCreary. So what we're going to do is kind of like a 3x3, I'm calling it here. Basically, I'm going to start really kind of low level just to make sure we all have a foundation. So kind of basic, intermediate, and advanced testing strategies, and then provide 3 examples for each. So in total, we're going to see 9. And I actually threw in a little bonus one just a few minutes ago at the end. So we're going to have 10 strategies here for testing Laravel that'll kind of progressively get more involved. So the beginning, again, a little basic, and then we'll move quickly into intermediate stuff, and then end with like some advanced mocking strategies, which I know everyone's pretty interested in those. So if there's time at the end, I'll cover some other stuff, and of course, I'll be in the chat to mingle all afternoon, as well as an attendee, because I'm excited for some of the future talks. So let's jump in. Again, this first section is laying a foundation. So what I want to get into first is just write tests. It's really, something that, again, not said to kind of push you or, be intimidating or, peer pressure you necessarily. This is more in like the Nike sense, just do it, right? Don't worry so much if you're not writing tests like how to get started or which type of test you're supposed to write, integration or feature or unit or acceptance. Don't worry about all that stuff. Just get in there and start writing tests. It's one of those things where any test, honestly, is pretty much better than no tests. And a lot of times I'll jump into an application, even my own application, and I just shed a little bit of a tear when I see in the test folder that it's only the example tests that come out of the box with Laravel. And again, whether this is my application, an application I'm working on with a client, an application I'm upgrading through the human shifts, it's just something that, again, it makes me feel a little less confident about the application. And it makes me feel like maybe there's a little extra work cut out for me. So when I do see the tests, again, it's nice. When I don't see them, it's kind of like, we gotta do this. Come on. So again, just write those tests. You're gonna feel a lot better about it. To that point, though, I don't necessarily have tests for everything. So this is right now current snapshot of LaravelShift.com. Run all the tests here. There's over 300 tests, nearly 1,000 assertions that are happening. But honestly, this is only about 60% test coverage. I don't necessarily write tests for everything. Again, don't worry about meeting those grades of 100% coverage, A+. It's okay, right? And as we noticed, there's even some incomplete tests here. There's some things that I know I would want to write some tests for, but maybe in an MVP or a quick fashion, I had to launch it. I wanted to get it out the door, and I didn't finish those tests, right? They're incomplete. And again, this is all okay, right? Some tests, or even incomplete tests, in my opinion, are better than no tests at all. So with that said, don't worry about 100% coverage. Don't worry about all the terminology. Just get in there and start writing tests. Start gaining confidence. That's what tests are about for me. It's about confidence that my application is behaving as I expect. It's confidence that I can maintain that application moving forward. It's confidence that I can change that application, truly refactor it, That's what tests are about. Again, it's not about the coverage or the type or any of that. It's just about the confidence. And if I write a test that gives me confidence, then that's invaluable to me, and it doesn't really matter how it's done. Kind of the next point is start small, right? This is another area that I think developers struggle to kind of, that barrier to entry with testing is, where do I get started? How do I get started? What if I have an existing application? Which test should I write first? What if I have a legacy application? How do I write tests for that? So the answer is, again, just start small. I think a lot of developers struggle with this is because the natural inclination when you're testing is to go in and start testing the most complicated piece of your application. And in this case, I've got a test here that I've written for the order controller, the checkout flow, right? So to store that order, I need to charge a card, I'm gonna send some emails, I'm gonna fire an event. This is a massive test. This does a lot. No matter which way you write this or break up the application, you're gonna have a lot of assertions. You're gonna have a lot of setup. You're gonna need to seed the database with users and products and all sorts of things. So this is a complicated test to write. And the hard truth is, when you're starting out the test, you are not ready to write this test. You're just simply not gonna be there, and that's okay. Again, you wanna start small. So don't start with the most important thing. Just start small, figure out a really small piece of the application. And honestly, it can be something that's almost, in retrospective, like a little silly to test. Here's a test just for the home controller, but what it's teaching me is how to make an HTTP request using Laravel's testing layer, how to make assertions that that response is as I expect. You're gonna start to gain some momentum in writing these simple tests. In the beginning, it's not about gaining confidence in the application's behavior. It's about gaining confidence in your ability to test the application. So again, start small, gain momentum, write another test. Your next test can use newer assertions. You can test deeper behavior. And eventually you'll be writing tests which use factories and to check the database or run against the test database. You'll be firing more complex HTTP requests using authentication in this case. And again, you'll be using more assertions within the framework. So the whole point here is if you start small, you're gonna gain momentum and eventually you're gonna work your way up to testing those more critical pieces. But again, if you start there, you're likely gonna fail. So don't feel bad, again, starting out, writing a test that maybe doesn't have a lot of value. Again, its value is in helping you get started testing, not so much in that confidence per se. So, and that's fine. Again, it's all about getting started. Something else that can help you get started, and there's a bunch of these packages out there. This just happens to be one that I help maintain. It was originally developed by Marcel. This is just a nice package that can get in there and generate model factories for you. So again, if you're testing an application, this is just yet another way to kind of hit the ground running. I also have some things to share later on, more packages. So again, this is just one of them, but it generates all your model factories for you by analyzing your current existing application. So again, just more ways to, again, gain that momentum and get started right away. Okay, and the last thing kind of in the basic bit here is make sure your tests communicate intent. And this is on a couple different levels, so we'll jump in here. First of all, one very simple thing I like to do is I like to make sure that I'm relaying what it is I'm testing. And with Laravel's HTTP tests in particular, sometimes this might not be always clear, especially if you're writing them in kind of a feature style where they don't line up one-to-one, their naming and their file name or their location in the test folder doesn't line up with the application. So I like to use this little PHP doc C annotation, and this is just the fully qualified name to whatever thing it is I'm testing, the subject under test. And again, in a feature or an integration style test, that might not be always so clear. So this is a nice way to do it. And in most editors, you can control click or command click into that and jump right to the thing that you're testing. So it's pretty nice if you're testing multiple things in the same test class, that's fine too. You can use this right above each test case instead of the class. So just a nice little way to communicate what you're testing, right? Another thing about tests is in the setup, sometimes this can get a little confusing. And as developers, we're honestly a little lazy, or we might want to make our tests really, really compact. And in doing so, we lose a little bit of that communication, right? So this is just a basic test that I pulled from Blueprint. It's out there, or it was out there in the real world until I made these refactors I'm about to talk about. But the setup, focusing in on this, is easy, right? It's just a bunch of dummy data. But what the heck is going on here? I originally wrote this just a few weeks ago, but last week I was updating this execute method, and I came in here to start updating this test and kind of drive out that new functionality. And I just couldn't remember what's going on here. Like, I'm shuffling some digits and I'm randomizing those. And at a high level, I get it. Like, I want to randomize some data to give me just a little bit of test variance. And that's fine, but it's just completely unclear what I was doing in this setup. And this is actually, oddly enough, something Caleb and Adam were talking about just a few weeks ago on Twitter. They were going back and forth. And Caleb had this nice streamlined test. And again, nothing wrong with this test per se, but it just didn't have that communication that we're talking about here. And, you know, it's one of those things where it happens, right? I have it in my own code here. This just didn't relay the intent of what this test was trying to do and how it was trying to do it. So just a really tiny refactor. Again, doesn't have to be all this world building data. It can just be the test. It can have just a little bit more context with those names and those variables to, again, more closely relay what happens in the real world. So instead of just these crazy digits that I'm doing some random logic on, you know, I can say, oh, this is the Blueprint draft content, and then I should get like an array of tokens back, whatever they might be. And here's what that's going to look like in the registry. And I'm still using that dummy data, but again, just tweaks that communication a bit more to tell me how I'm testing this, right? The final basic piece here is also to relay communication, and we can do this through our test cases themselves. And this is just another strategy here. These top two are a little more unit style, and I think that that's fine. Some people like a 1-to-1 ratio between the assertions and the test cases. I'm not necessarily hardcore about that per se, if it's kind of this unit style. So we see this is empty, pretty straightforward, two assertions, the empty set's empty, of course, and the one set, something in it, not empty, right? Same with size. The empty set's a size of 0, the one set's a size of 1, the mini set has 3. These are all pretty straightforward things. So those are clearly communicating alone. But when we jump down to maybe more of a behavioral test, this testing of remove, there's a lot more going on here, and there's more of an opportunity to communicate that intent. And this has multiple tests buried inside of it that would be nice to kind of understand more what's going on. So we can break this out, just like anything else, into several different test cases to communicate why we're setting this up, why we're writing this test in the first place. So for example, buried within that larger test remove was removing multiple items. So I've broken that out to its own test case. We also had test doesn't remove an arbitrary item. It just doesn't blindly remove something, right? I want to make sure that if I try to remove an object that's not in there, again, that object or that item that was originally in there is still there. It didn't just arbitrarily remove items randomly from this set class. And finally, another test case broken out, again, to relay the intent. Here, test remove honors the type, right? The implementation is using strict equality. If I have an integer 3 and I try to remove the string 3, again, that's not going to get removed. So by breaking these up, again, I have an opportunity to communicate the intent and even document some of the requirements of what this method is. So don't necessarily write just one huge test for everything and just keep going, right? You don't have to go to the other extreme of a 1-to-1 ratio between test cases and assertions. But at the same time, you do want to make sure you're communicating any kind of requirements in there. So again, why you're testing, make sure that's relayed in your test cases. Just another really quick example of that, even at a high level integration or HTTP test in this case, we can still do the same thing. We can make sure, instead of just testing the happy path of storing a coupon and redirecting, I want to make sure I don't use an invalid coupon code. I don't use an expired coupon code. A user can't reuse a coupon over and over again. So again, I'm dictating those requirements by clearly indicating them through separate test cases. So nice little basic strategies there to make sure your tests are clear, they're indicating what's going on, and they're communicating, again, requirements and potentially even documenting them. Okay, section 2. I'm going to get a little drink here. All right, return on investment. The reality here is that as much as I like testing and believe it makes me a better developer, again, the reality is that writing tests does indeed take a little more time, right? It's going to pay off in the long run, but short term, it's going to take me more time. I'm writing more code. It's just, you know, code physics, if you will, right? It's a reality of the situation. So if I'm going to spend the time writing these tests, I want to make sure, again, that I'm getting value, I'm gaining confidence with every test that I write. So these strategies are focused a little more on making sure you get that return on investment. Okay, so first of all, obviously, right, use the framework. The framework gives us PHP unit out of the box, de facto PHP testing library. It's all wired up, pre-configured to run with Laravel right out of the box. HTTP tests are a surefire way to test large portions of your application very effectively, very efficiently. So high return on investment with HTTP tests. If you're not testing your application at all, definitely start with HTTP tests. You're going to get the most bang on your buck. You're going to touch the most pieces of your application through single tests. All the assertions that Laravel gives us, ways to assert things are in the database, or as we saw, views were returned, or views had data, things are in the session. These are all level ups. There's no reason to kind of roll these yourself or test at a really low level. Try to leverage those there. A lot of bang for your buck. Of course, factories or seeders, being able to set up a test database and actually just hit it very quickly, very efficiently is, again, a high return on investment. And finally, mocking. Laravel's done a great job at having all of its kind of core components be easily mocked or faked, which we're going to talk about more in the advanced section. But all these things are available for us. Let's just take a quick look at what these look like in code. If you're not familiar, again, you can extend your test case classes with a Laravel test case. This is going to give you all those assertions, all the HTTP testing layer we talked about a minute ago. There's all sorts of traits that are offered. We can decorate this class with a faker implementation to generate fake data quickly. We can refresh the database per test case run. There's database transactions if you're pre-building a database. Again, all sorts of traits Laravel provides us. We see those factories like we saw before. We see event faking happening here. We got the request, HTTP request in this case. We can build up that request in all sorts of different ways: authentication, headers, cookies, session data, send all the different HTTP verbs, and finally a rich set of assertions that are available for us. So again, framework provides all this, no reason not to use it. Jump in there, it'll get you going really, really quickly, high return on investment. Another good return on investment are data providers. So this is actually built into PHP unit, but I don't see them used, honestly, very often within Laravel applications, but I think they have some really high return. So this is a really simple case here where I have a model method and it just has a download, right? And this is for the Confident Laravel video course. And some of the courses have additional code sample downloads. And so I just want to test that model in a very kind of unit way, but I don't want to write a test for every single different video, right? That's a lot of tests to write. Again, not a very good return on investment on all of those. Instead, I can focus in on this has download and leverage that data provider annotation. And what this is going to do is allow me to provide data to this test case in the form of parameters, which are injected in as we saw. And then simply in this provider, I can return an array of arrays of that data with all the different test cases I want. So in this case, I can say a null video or whatever is going to not have a download. Video 1 doesn't have a download. 8 and 9 do, and I can very quickly build all these out. So the data provider is very, very powerful to take kind of a generic test, but being able to rerun it with a lot of different data very, very quickly, very, very efficiently. So definitely be sure to leverage those if you ever have any kind of repeated test cases that need to be run. Instead of copying and pasting that test case and slightly varying it, you can figure out ways to do that with a data provider to just automate running that over and over and over with just varying those slight bits. One more quick example, a little more real world, is purchasing power parity. All of the courses I have offer this. It's a way to provide discounts to countries with differing local economies, differing local currencies. Again, instead of writing one for India and Brazil and the Ukraine and all the different countries, I can use a data provider that even wires up to a database to give me that data back and make sure that that code's behaving as expected when it's given a country and a code and gives me the right correct percent off, right? So data providers, very powerful. The last piece here is more about unit tests. And I think sometimes, again, the Laravel community maybe doesn't lean on unit tests as much as we could. And again, this is because Laravel makes feature testing or integration testing very, very, again, easy through HTTP tests. So that's great. But never underestimate a unit test. It's the other side of the coin. And pun here being united we stand, right? We have another option and we want to make sure to be able to leverage that too to give us the most from our testing system. I think a great example of this and something I've talked about before are form requests. Form requests do a lot of work. And if you really want to test these effectively, it takes a lot of code. So let's kind of see what I'm talking about here. This is just taken from the registration controller, the register controller out of the Laravel auth controllers. And it's just wired up inside of a form request to create that user. And we see we take an email and password at a very basic level. We want to make sure that the email is required and it's unique and all that stuff. The characters, the password's 8 characters. It's confirmed, all sorts of things. There's a lot that's actually happening here. Visually, it's very simple because, again, Laravel makes this great, right? But from a testing perspective, strictly speaking, if we really wanted to test this thoroughly and completely, we would have to write a test for an HTTP test in this case, for an empty email address, for an invalid email address, for the uniqueness of that email, empty password, invalid password, the unconfirmed password. And then finally, a HTTP test for the happy path, everything's valid and it went through. That's a lot of tests to write if you truly want to hit each one of those components. And the truth is, the equation for that basically is the number of test cases is equal to the number of rules plus 1 plus that happy path. And that's kind of an n+1 problem if you think about it, right? It's basically directly correlated to the number of rules. So as that form increases in fields or complexity of those rules, it's more and more tests we have to write. And again, the hard truth is that nobody's writing all those tests, right? We just don't have time for that. That's not a high return on investment. What's most likely are people are probably writing that happy path test and then maybe one of the more complex tests. And again, that's fine. From a confidence perspective, it's one of those things that if it's confident, that's all you have to write. But there's a better way to write that where I don't have to write a test for everything, right? All in of those rules, that order of operation, that constant scale. I can write something that's actually just flatlined, an O of 1 operation. And that's always what we want as computer scientists, as programmers. We want something that's just real time, right? So let's see what that looks like. Well, it looks like a unit test. What we can do is actually test that rule by calling that form request object, because at the end of the day, it's just an array that gets returned. And again, I think a lot of times in the community, this is kind of dismissed as spell checking. And while that's accurate, it dismisses, again, that return on investment. This is a high return on investment test. I've effectively tested all, no matter how many I have, all of the validation with one single simple test. And while there are some trade-offs I'm going to talk about here in a second, this is, again, high return on investment. Single test, all validation is returned. Now, to those trade-offs, there's a couple things here, right? Maybe the syntax isn't what's being used inside there. Maybe the order of operations or the order of the rules gets swapped around, or maybe I add another rule later. So as it stands right now, we're looking at this test is rather brittle, admittedly. But what we can do is use assert validation rules. And this is an assertion that I've added in a test package I'll share here in a second. But this takes away some of that brittleness. It looks at this, and it doesn't matter which syntax you're using. If you're using the pipe delimited syntax for your validation rules, if you're using the array syntax, even if you're using some of the object syntax to create rules, this assertion is actually smart enough to normalize those and test them. And it actually tests a subset as well, much like the assert JSON or assert exact JSON that come from the Laravel test response assertions. So this is something that kind of mitigates some of that, and again, gives you high return on investment there as well. The other nice thing is that this actually can extend PHP units test case directly, which means that these tests, as a true unit test, run a little bit faster because they don't have to build up the entire application and fire off those HTTP requests. So again, there's some trade-offs here. Some are good, some are bad. We're going to keep talking about them. But the point is that this is a very, very efficient test, very, very easy to write. The other test that I have to write for this is really just to assert that the linkage is there. And by linkage, I mean that that controller action uses this form request. So just through a little reflection, we just basically make sure that that's type hinted, because that's, by the laws of Laravel, how form request validation work. So for 2 tests, I get any coverage, no matter the rules, on all of the validation. So compared to no test, this is a very high return on investment test that you can write to get started with testing that validation and get a large swath. So we test all the validation with 1 test, we test all the linkage with 1 more test, 2 tests always, no matter the size of the validation. Those Laravel test assertions are here again in this package I talked about. There's more assertions here, there's more matchers than what we saw, so definitely check out this library if you're interested in using some of these alternative styles of tests. Now, I want to be clear about some of the trade-offs. You have to use a form request, right? Some people like to use request validation inline in the controller. So that's not necessarily something that currently is helpful here. Rules can change. This is a common pushback, right? From that kind of spell checking strategy here, from that unit strategy. What if the rules change in a future version of Laravel and that doesn't behave as it did in the past? And then finally, that's pretty simple logic, right? What if I have more complex, validation rules inside of there? I don't feel like the form request is too bad of a trade-off. I think they're pretty common, obviously, in Laravel. The framework provides them. They're a core object. And we're seeing the community talk more and more about how you can leverage these form requests. So they're just a great way to encapsulate this data. So I just don't consider that too bad of a trade-off. As far as the rules changing, doesn't bother me as the creator of Shift. I obviously dog food my own product. Shift is going to either automate the change of that rule or notate it in the PR comments and let me know, hey, this changed. And even if I don't use Shift, hopefully you're reading the upgrade guide, it's going to be notated there. So that can be mitigated pretty well. So really all we're left with is simple logic. This is limited to that. It's something, again, there are some options here, but if you have very, very complex options, this might not be the best for you, in which case, just write that HTTP test. But the point here is that you can write an HTTP test just for that one path of validation, instead of, again, having to write an HTTP test for everything. Okay, moving on to the last section. Don't mock me. So what we're going to talk about here are some mocking strategies inside of Laravel. So Laravel provides us, again, very rich ways to test our code, but in the normal world without Laravel, this might be a little bit harder. So let's take a look at kind of how this all plays out. So first of all, we have the request coming in. This might be something we would have to build up and kind of inject into this if we were testing without Laravel. Same with the response. There's all sorts of helpers that are happening here. So how would we hook into those inside of Laravel? And again, the nice thing is actually both of these are something that Laravel provides for us through that HTTP testing layer. So no problems there. We also have this kind of static creation here, this ORM layer, Eloquent, right, that we're all familiar with and love. But this could be another area that's difficult to test. But we saw before with database factories that this is something that allows us, again, through Laravel's testing layer, to test very easily and effectively by just using fixture data, dummy data, whatever you want to call it, through those factories in a test database. So we can actually just kind of use, quote unquote, the real thing. So this really just leaves areas of our code that maybe communicate with other parts of the application, that communicate with framework, core framework components, or they communicate with our own services. So whether this is the event helper, which we know underneath is simply the event fire facade, but again, whether it's newing up a different service, whatever that custom code is here, that business logic, that's what we want to focus in on here. We need a way to be able to test that. And there's several different ways. So let's start jumping into those. We can test them through dependency injection. This is kind of the classic approach. And then of course we can test them by hacking into the container, right? And Laravel, while it does use dependency injection, normally those are resolved automatically through the container. So what we're really going to focus on here is the strategy of using the container. So looking at that same code we saw just a second ago, here's the test for that. We see here this event fake, right? And this is some magic mocking that's happening underneath the covers by Laravel. And so really effectively what this is we're setting up a mock using McCreary to create a fake object, a dummy object, a test double is probably the most accurate term. And then we're swapping that out in the container by reference or its abstraction. In this case, just the event string is how it's referenced in the container. And then we're swapping that with our mock. So that means that anytime our code, as we saw our implementation, is using that event facade, or the event helper, which uses the facade, it's going to instead give us, the container's instead going to resolve that to our event mock. And now we can do some additional things with it. So the framework provides all sorts of these underneath the hood. It gives you a bus fake, an event fake, a mail fake, a notification fake, a queue fake, a storage fake. In 7, there's going to be more. HTTP fake is coming up. Taylor's probably going to be talking about that here in just a bit. And then finally, all of the facades can be swapped just as we saw here. So again, very powerful mocking right out of the box that Laravel provides. So we're going to focus on these for a little bit, but we're also going to talk about custom mocking as well. So we know we can mock Laravel's stuff as we saw here, but what about when we want to mock libraries, especially some of the common libraries that Laravel uses, right? Or we use in our Laravel application. So let's take a look at the other side of that event. So we fired the event, but let's look at the listener, which is just a closure within this application. And so we can kind of focus in on that, and we see that when that video event is returned, or sorry, when that video watched event is fired, that we basically add a tag to our newsletter, to our subscribers, right? I want to know, just from a business perspective, hey, who's viewed that video in case I make changes to it or updates or, you know, whatever, share some new code samples. That way I can email all those people and say, hey, check this out. Here's some new material. Now this newsletter bit is actually from the Spatie newsletter package, right? And it has this method add tags. So how do I test this, right? This is pretty common, right? Spatie makes all sorts of packages for Laravel. So how would I test this code? It's not necessarily core Laravel like we saw a minute ago. Well, there's a couple different approaches. First of all, one strategy you can do is actually check in the configuration if the package offers that. Is there a way to kind of disable this behavior? This is kind of the easiest low-level way to do that. And what I mean is look for a log or a null or some kind of innocuous driver that basically makes sure that this code isn't fired. That's really the easiest way to do this, is because if we just simply disable that behavior, we don't have to worry so much about it having side effects, and it's going to be a little bit easier to test. And even if we look at some of the core Laravel components, if you crack open, for example, the PHP unit configuration file that comes with Laravel, you'll see all sorts of drivers in there that are being set to these types of simple drivers where, again, they're not going to have so many side effects. They're a lot easier to test and run in that test environment. You'll see the array driver, the memory driver for the database, you know, sync for the queue. It's not going to, you don't need a whole, you know, Redis queue or anything like that, or database queue in your test environment. So again, check this first. If it's simply something that you can just fire and forget and you don't need to worry about testing, you might be able to use one of these log or null drivers. If you need to test it, if it has side effects and you need hooks into it to be able to control it and isolate that behavior truly using a mock, we can dig a little deeper. In this case, we can go take a look at this Spatie newsletter package. and we actually see that it's a facade. And you'll find that most packages that you use offer a facade. It's just a core pattern in Laravel. And again, because Laravel has made that testing layer so seamless, some of the side effects of this pattern are really just mitigated through that, right? Through that swapping in this case. So it's very easy to test this, even though it is a static or global object, right? So because it's a facade, that means that going back to our test, we can basically set up a mock through this, through McCreary. We can expect its behavior in a certain way. It should receive this add tags with this dummy data that we've set up above. And then we swap it out, just like we saw before with Laravel's core components. We just call that newsletter facade. We tell it to swap for our particular newsletter mock, which we've set up to have certain expectations and behave a very certain way for the purposes of our test. So again, very simple way to test even a library that's outside of Laravel because it's using some of those core things that we're familiar with. Okay, so again, most packages are mostly facades, and because of that, we can swap them out and take advantage of this mocking strategy that we saw before. What about something else? Maybe that's not necessarily a facade per se, it's truly a static class in this case. Well, again, take a look at their documentation. This is Carbon, for example, and it actually has a way to test the times, right? We can explicitly set a time and snapshot that time to be something that our application can use, and therefore, therefore Laravel uses, and therefore our application uses. So what that looks like in our code, here I have an invite link if you've joined a team inside of Shift, for example, and I'm just simply calling that Carbon set test now, and what this is going to do is freeze the now time to be right now. It's not going to change every time I call it if this test takes even just a couple seconds to run, right? And this is important because not only might my application be using time, but even the low-level components of the framework are. And I've chosen this example because here I'm actually using a signed route, and this creates that in this case, a temporary signed route where that invitation only lasts 24 hours. So if I want to test that, I have to be able to manipulate time, not only in my test, but again, also core Laravel. And so in this case, it's that 24-hour period. Now there's a little gotcha with this, and it's definitely a time drain, which is why I wanted to note this here. Be very, very careful when you're setting this up, especially in this capacity, because if you're using mutatable date times, right, within Carbon, as you start to add time to that, you're actually manipulating your frozen time. So be very, very careful with that, especially if you're using variables. This is one of the reasons, especially in this example, that I like to continually use that now helper, because I know that I'm always getting a fresh Carbon instance and I'm not mutating a snapshotted time maybe higher up. So again, in those examples, they used a known date time. That's totally fine. Just make sure that you're not mutating that. You're making it an immutable one, so you're always getting a new instance. We've definitely run into that problem before where I've snapshotted the set test now with Carbon, and I've started running tests and it's just totally not behaving like I want, and I'm dumping out all the date times and they're off by 24 hours or whatever it is, and it's like, why is this changing? I snapshotted it. It's often because you're mutating your frozen time underneath the covers. So just be leery of that, be careful of that, and make sure one way to mitigate it here is just to always just new up a new time using that now helper Laravel provides. Okay, another really nasty one, but very common inside of Laravel is testing something like Guzzle. So we have this new client. I'm calling up to get a geocoded IP address, and this is something that if I wanted to test this, I would actually maybe need to get a real IP address and so forth. And again, that can be a bit annoying. So if we go again out to the documentation, we take a look at Guzzle. There actually is a way to test Guzzle. There's a couple different ways actually, but I don't think many of us are going to want to bring up a test web server. So the easiest one is this mock handler. And this mock handler allows me to queue up a set of responses and then inject that into the client instead of actually making real calls. So instead, these are just going to be popped off one by one for each call that I make with Guzzle. So again, let's see what that looks like in Laravel. So this Guzzle integration test or this API test to geocode an API, we see here that I set up all this mock handler, this handler stack. So let's go through this one by one. So here's the code to basically mock out Guzzle. I set up a new mock handler just like the docs describe, and I can queue up as many as I want, but in this case, I only need one response. I'm going to allow it to be a 200 response, a successful response. It's going to be JSON, and a little off screen here is just the JSON data I want to be returned. Again, copying from the documentation, I set up a new handler stack here with that mock handler queue, and then I assign it to a new fresh Guzzle client. And then the real piece here, just like we learned before, is we want to now feed that into the container underneath some kind of reference. So in this case, I've just used a string reference in the container as an abstract. You could use an interface, you could use a real service, whatever it is you want to use. We just swap that out as we've done on all the other mocking that we've seen already with this fake client. Now, the next important piece is going back to our implementation code. We need to make sure, again, to be able to now pull that in from the container. So we've pushed one into it. We need to pull it out from the container. So we can no longer use that new up of a client. There's a couple different ways we could do this. We could, we could inject it into this function and allow Laravel to automatically resolve it. We could bind it in the container. However we want to do it. But the point here is that anytime you see that new, you probably don't have the proper hooks in your implementation to be able to get at that mock setup that you've done. So we can resolve that by using the resolve helper to pull this out by reference, in this case, that geocoder.client reference that we did before. And now we have that on our implementation side, and it's going to pull in that mock, make requests to that handler stack, and pop them off the queue in order. So in this case, use that mock response. The nice thing about all this is it's actually a real response, or it's a real Guzzle response, which means the rest of this code can play on. A lot of the times this becomes really difficult, I think, for developers is because you could mock out Guzzle with a very similar strategy, but then you're going to mock the response and mock all the different methods you call in the response. And anytime you're doing something like that, definitely take a minute and see if there's a better way, because otherwise you're going to get yourself in kind of mock craziness. And that's definitely another scenario where you can be a little more spell checky and that test is a bit more brittle. So this test is really nice because, again, it's returning a real Guzzle response, which allows the rest of our code to just kind of play on without any kind of additional mocking. So great way, again, to mock another client that's really common in Laravel applications to be able to test it effectively and quickly. Okay, so again, check these packages for any kind of built-in mocks, whether that's through a facade or through what the library provides. We saw with Carbon, it provides the set test now, and Guzzle provides this mock handler stack. Okay, finally, last point here. Let's check the time. Good, I'm good on time. Advanced custom mocking. Okay, so what about when we have some of our own services or a third-party service that just doesn't have any of these things we've seen before? Okay, so a prime example of this, going back to that order controller, is I probably have something in here, the classic example of some kind of payment that I need to do, in this case, Stripe. And Stripe has this static charge, and you check the Stripe documentation, there's no way for me to hook into this as we've seen with Carbon or Guzzle. So how do I kind of isolate and test this code without having to make a real Stripe call? And this is the timeless example. But just for clarity, this can be any type of code, okay? This can be any kind of object, method call, any kind of service object I need to do. So whether this is some repository query that I'm firing off, or maybe I have some WordPress integration where I'm making a post, whatever this is what I'm talking about. It's any of this type of code that's just third party or within the application. It's providing very rich functionality, and as it stands right now, is very hard to test and leaves you with the question of, how do I test this? short of mocking every single, chain call on this, right? And again, we want to do something better than that. So going back to kind of that original charge example, we can basically turn this into an object, right? We want to encapsulate that hard to test functionality. This kind of goes back to Kent Beck's, make the hard change easy and then make the easy change. So this piece of our code is very hard to test. We're going to wrap it up in an object. We're going to move that off to the side. And now we're going to give ourselves some hooks to test that object or test that behavior in isolation. And so here's our payment gateway, and we now have the proper hook we need, or we can set up the proper hooks we need to test and mock this piece directly. Now, what this strategy is called, or at least who I learned it from, was J.B. Rainsberger. He's more popular in the Java community, but he really does a lot of talks and consulting on testing. He calls this pushing it to the boundary. So he takes a hard to test piece of code. He encapsulates that. It's really core and low in our application stack. He takes that, he moves it to an object that's just a little higher up in the food chain, right? A little closer to the boundary. And now he can test both of those separately. One in isolation, easy, mock, and then still write that real integration test, but for that very, very tiny piece of code instead of the whole order control or order checkout flow like we're doing now. So let's take a look at what that looks like. We basically jump down, we see in our test, we set up that payment gateway, we mock it out using Laravel. Same as before, we set up our expected calls that it should receive charge with the token, the email, that order that has been set up, and it's going to return some kind of fake charge ID that allows the rest of that code to play on. So just a couple lines of code, and now we're testing in isolation a very critical piece of the order control flow that was otherwise would have been hard, if not impossible, to test without making a real call to Stripe in this case. So again, just going through the mechanics, we use the mock helper that allows us to just instantly create a McCreary mock underneath of the class type payment gateway. We set up its expectation that it should receive charge, return the charge ID, and that allows us to kind of play on. Now, that bonus one that I promised, number 10, final piece here, real-time facades. Big fan of this, and it ties very nicely into what we were just looking at. So let's go back to our implementation. That payment gateway is great, and we see that this works, right, by kind of encapsulating this, pushing it to the boundary in a nice little service object. But that's not the only piece. Just like Guzzle, we have to now make sure that we're either dependency injecting this or registering it with the container. So in this case, I'm actually doing both, technically speaking. I'm injecting it into the controller action through method injection, which then in turn is resolving that from the container. That's a couple different steps, right? I have to not only change my method signature, but potentially have to go jump in my app service provider to register and bind that accordingly. And again, it'd be nice if this was all here and lightweight and easy to do, right? The pushing it to the boundary was very quick steps, right? We've already made the class, that was enough, right? I don't want to have to do all those other things. Well, we can with real-time facades. We can basically take that app service payment gateway that we did and turn it into a real-time facade. No registering in the container. We know now that it's a facade. We can mock it out and swap it just like we have with any other facade that we've already tested. It's very familiar, right? And we can do that very simply by just referencing that service object we made and prefixing its namespace with facades. Laravel automatically wires this up as a facade and gives us all of that all of that facade behavior, the swapping behavior that we want for testing. So instead of injecting it now, I can simply just leverage it like any other facade in a static capacity, and I don't have to inject it. So going back to the test case, the simple change here is instead of making it a mock, I turn it into a facade. And so I create my own mock. It doesn't need to be anything special, so it's just an empty mock, or an unnamed mock, as McCreary calls it. And then like before, like we said, I just swap it out with the payment gateway. So again, very, very simple way, real-time facades, even less work to do to be able to push that hard to test code to the boundary and be able to test it familiarly, easily, just like we have before. So no container bindings, no registry, no dependency injections, all just kind of auto magic. we're grokking the framework, using those facades even more. That, again, very powerful and rich way to test your application. And again, familiar. It's a super familiar way to mock. You're just going to be doing that over and over in your application, as we saw before with Laravel core components, packages, and now even custom objects within your application. So that's pretty much brings us to the end. A lot of stuff there. For additional resources, definitely check out the Base Code podcast. Technically, it's kind of our second season. It was 6 episodes on testing. I kind of, same as this talk was, very short episodes. Jess and I go back and forth about, getting excited about testing, how we test, what we like to test, all the things we saw here. We talk about mocking. Great little snapshot episodes to be able to listen to and kind of refresh, and again, get that motivation to just write tests. So check that out. There's also the Laravel test generator, which I mentioned before. To get started, to gain that momentum very quickly, you can go out, run this. It looks at your route list to basically determine all of your controllers, your controller actions, the middleware it's using, and it automatically generates intelligently test stubs to be able to start writing the code with real assertions, mocks up those HTTP tests. It does some faking automatically for you in there. It pre-builds your factories, all sorts of things. So again, if you have an existing application with 0 tests, this is an incredible value to be able to go out and, again, gain that momentum instantaneously, combine it with those other packages that we were talking about to get your applications up and running with tests, and be able to start building those out and finalizing those over time. But again, gets all that set up, hours and hours of work, depending on how large your application is saved here. So definitely check that out. And then finally, as part of the digital swag, if you're new to testing, if you have no tests, if you want a deeper dive into everything I talked about here with more examples, more strategies, bonus videos, 30% off as part of the digital swag until the end of the month. So a couple more days, you can pick up my course, Confident Laravel, again at a discount. So all those are listed here. Follow me on Twitter for more testing tips, other Laravel tips, projects I'm working on like Blueprint, as we saw here. Listen to the Base Code podcast, learn more. Here's the discounted code bit.ly link for Confident Laravel, and then a link to automate all that with the test generator shift. So take a screenshot of this. I'll also post it in my speaker chat here in just a second. And to that point, I'll be around all day in chat as an attendee, looking forward to all the talks from the other speakers. So I welcome your feedback. Hopefully I kicked things off right here. And with that, I don't think we're doing any questions, but Ian, if you want to jump back in, let me know. Otherwise,
I'm back.
Sweet.
Yeah, it was a fantastic way to kick it off. Really great. Loved it. There's a couple questions in there. One might be, some of them might be a little too much, but I guess we have time for one. So
yeah, let's do a few.
What do you think about PHP unit versus Laravel Dusk, and when you should use each, or kind of best practices for when you'd want to use one over the other?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I definitely talk about it more in Confident Laravel, but the example I use there, just to kind of chat it out for a second, is, if I'm definitely getting to a point where my tests are maybe looking at markup, or they're needing to truly interact with a page in some way, Dusk is just an amazing tool to be able to kind of automate that. Again, it goes back to kind of that return on investment. I could write that with a series of HTTP tests, but it's going to be a lot of that touch point testing. I'm not going to get that full behavior all the way through. So it's really nice. Admittedly, I don't write a lot of Dust tests because I'm pretty thorough about kind of clicking through an application. So again, it depends on the return on investment. But if you do want to check an order flow or some kind of interaction with the site that's mission critical, Dusk is definitely the way to go, and how I would jump in testing. But I still believe that the HTTP tests are probably the most bang for the buck, the most automation. Not that Dusk has a huge learning curve, but it's definitely a little bit more setup. You got to get the driver and all that kind of stuff for the browser and everything.
Okay, awesome. Let's do one more. best practices for setting up data across multiple feature tests. So if you're kind of using the same data over and over in your different tests.
Yeah, there's been some great conversation on Twitter about that lately. You know, there's a couple different options. So I know Titan has a great post on factory classes, a nice way to kind of objectify in a class and again encapsulate all of that building that maybe is around an order, because normally when you're building an order, you're building a product, you're building a user, maybe a coupon code. So having a class that you can call and generate all that to the point of their blog post really kind of, again, encapsulates that and makes it kind of just a nice, very communicated way to do all that at once without having to have all that set up. Another nice way, again, that's being chatted about on Twitter are database seeds. So you can definitely create a seeder that gives you pre-built data and all the respective, tables in your database, builds all those out again, and there you can reference that. So I know, and maybe even in the next talk, we might even hear something about that. So those are two great ways, I think, if you're having a lot of repetitive data. And, the factories are kind of the little Legos, and then, a seeder or a factory class is really kind of more of the final product. So if you're finding yourself building sets of data very, very commonly, I would definitely encapsulate those using one of those strategies.
Awesome. As always, fantastic job. Really appreciate it. Now let's switch over to Jonathan. So if you could, yep. There we go.
Let me relinquish.
Beautiful.
Cool. All right. See you guys.
All right. See you later.